They thought, oh, let's go to New Zealand and build like big nuclear bunkers.
That's where we're going to see a lot of people left behind. They're just not going to be on the same boat.
You only get utopian experiments when society breaks down. This is part of the problem.
Ben, episode 3, we're here again. Let's talk about escaping nations. One of the things I want to sort of bring up was kind of a lead on from the previous 2 episodes is about the national state and whether tech barons actually want to get rid of that whole system and kind of what your thoughts on that may be.
Yeah, so afternoon, first of all. It's a trend these days amongst a lot of the tech barons to want to escape from the national state. Certainly, it's been a tendency for a long time to see the national state as kind of holding back technological development, society, entrepreneurialism. So it kind of comes out of that, and then there's this kind of idea that somehow you can just escape completely from the state. So I was thinking maybe for this episode we could dig into that idea of kind of escaping the state a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So it's trying to get rid of from that kind of bureaucracy or the red tape and stuff that kind of gets in the way of these big organisations, which, as we talked about before, have sort of got a very big handle on things in terms of algorithms, social media, things like that, and the way they see things kind of pushing forward and changing that kind of system. And this whole talk of, seasteading and micronations, which they've been trying to sort of get into as well to move them away from those kind of democratic bubbles so they can operate those entities as corporations still, all right?
Yeah, and you remember, I think last week we talked a little bit about this idea of the network state and the idea that Silicon Valley and tech companies could just kind of opt out of the US and go somewhere else and just kind of run things autonomously somewhere else. So we talked about that idea a little bit. Maybe just to talk about a couple of the inspirations and the background for this episode. So one book that I read recently is this book called Crack Up Capitalism. It's by a Canadian academic called Quinn Slobodian, and he's written a lot about the kind of, monetarist, neoliberal, kind of narco-capitalist that we mentioned last week. So he's written a book about that, and it's called Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. Because his fundamental theory is that they want to move away from democracy because they see it as a barrier. And then maybe another book to mention is one, I think it's by Neil Stephenson. It's a novel called Cryptonomicon.
Okay.
It's really good, actually. Big kind of exciting sci-fi novel, and it's basically about these people who want to start this data center on this kind of island with a volcano somewhere that's just completely outside of state jurisdiction, and that was a very popular book, which I think inspired a lot of the dreams as well. So just wanted to check those books because they form the background in a lot of these ideas.
Sure. And sort of like some of the key narratives that you mentioned sort of in this book, how does that sort of fully translate to the kind of world we are in now in 2025 as we see this kind of accelerationism of what's happening with the technocracy and democracy and everything that's kind of happening with, the whole Trump administration? We're seeing everything kind of unfold in different ways at the moment, and, how that lobbying is going to affect things in future. Are these tech companies going to still continue with lobbying things like the US administration, or are they going to be looking forward to create these seastead and these micronations? Is there any point in them sort of kind of pursuing that route,
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because in a way, I feel that with the new Trump administration, some of those same figures feel that they've captured the president administration. So maybe they're less eager to go and form new country somewhere else. So maybe that's something we can think about as well, because you've got a lot of the people who are associated with it, like Peter Thiel, for instance, who are now very influential with the new administration and are essentially interested in how they deal with US state power and how they change that. But then on the other hand, you still get these kind of attempts essentially to kind of bypass or disrupt the nation state, and that's something again very, very important to talk about. I think Elon Musk is quite conscious that he wants to disrupt a lot of the nation states, and that if countries go against what he wants to do, he can just go in there and kind of somehow bypass them, but almost kind of act as a sort of state actor in his own right.
It's almost like a kind of technological coup in a sort of way, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about this, everything that happened with Starlink, and obviously a couple of years ago he intervened in the whole thing around the Ukraine war, and then at some point there was a lot of discussion about whether he had switched off access to Starlink for certain areas, whether he could do that with Ukraine if they didn't go along with what he wanted, and so on. And then there was a lot of controversy also in Brazil, where Brazil basically pushed back against Twitter X for disinformation around their election and the attempted coup there. They got into a confrontation with Musk, shut down Twitter for a while. And again, really interesting because millions of Brazilians just in those few weeks migrated to Blue Sky. In fact, Blue Sky now has some of its biggest part of its user base is Brazilians, just because of those few weeks.
Wow.
And then it became a discussion about Starlink and like who actually controls the internet in Brazil and who's got the information.
Just talking again about sort of, we mentioned things like Starlink, and obviously Musk has put a ton of satellites up in the air to sort of kind of run that, and he's got operations like Tesla, which is seen as a car company, but some would argue that it's more of a data collection company. And he seems to be able to be accumulating a lot of data through Starlink, through Tesla, through all these things, and he's also kind of almost superseding the governments in terms of where they're going. I mean, what's your views in terms of that?
Yeah, I think he's found the spaces that are really good for him, and one of these is low orbit satellites because it's essentially an unregulated area. So he's just gone ahead and done it and just seen, how far he can go, and he's been really successful at doing that. Right, you just go out there and put it out there and see how far you can go and create your own system, and it works pretty well, right, as well, in terms of the user interface and everything. But he's basically colonized a bit of subspace with his satellites, without asking anyone if it's okay, and he's kind of got away with it, right? And then he's also building a city, right? So he's building this city in Texas, Starbase. They had the vote, I think, back in March about incorporating it as a city. Something like 60% of the people who live there are Tesla employees or employees of one of Musk's companies. So he's essentially creating a private city in Texas that's going to be a Starbase. So they've definitely, some of those people have definitely still got those dreams of creating their own, sovereign areas, I think.
Well, he's got control of the communication as well through Starlink to a degree with that as well, which we know is how it enables you to be able to control communities and things like that in the way you kind of want. And I think he mentioned before that, one of the biggest weapons is things like, memes and communication in the modern world as well. And we're seeing a lot of that, as we talked about in the previous episode, with sort of misinformation and disinformation, all that kind of stuff. But we've also got the kind of the categoric rise in the background as well of things like some of the stable cryptocurrencies and things, which is sort of kind of making these so-called almost sort of like digital or technologically based cities more of a thing that looks viable, so to speak. And with all the kind of unrest that's going on in the kind of states as well, people are going to be kind of looking towards what are the alternatives to the current government or current, democracy as it kind of stands.
Yeah, I think crypto is really interesting as well, and I know that I've dabbled in it a little bit. I think you have as well. I mean, the dream of crypto is you could make yourself independent, at least for me, of government regulations. It's also the dream of a lot of criminals and people as well, right?
Yeah.
People for different reasons, but part of the dream was that you had your money that you could just have somewhere that no one else could touch, and it was outside the grasp of governments. And I think that was a very compelling idea for so many people. That's why part of why it's been successful, right? And it is, for me, it's super clunky. It's never really worked as a medium of exchange. There's no point buying a cup of coffee with crypto because the transaction charges are so high. The interface is super chunky so far.
Well, I think there's a few things. First of all, this isn't any kind of financial advice whatsoever. So we're not in that realm whatsoever. But I mean, if we look at sort of like the real advent of the crypto, sort of back in 2008, after sort of like the markets crash and kind of what Bitcoin does versus sort of kind of fiat currency and how it's trying to be. Obviously, it's a very clunky system, but when I sort of talk about crypto, I'm talking mainly about sort of the three that have a chance of kind of lasting. One obviously is Bitcoin, which is quite slow in terms of transactions. Ethereum, which is supposed to be faster, but obviously the gas fees are extremely high. And then you've got Solana, which is coming in now to sort of kind of take the place to make these transactions faster. And the whole decentralization model that we talked about is kind of why most people bought into it. But when I was looking at crypto, there's a lot of banks who are getting involved as well. You'll find that there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of money, invested in from these large institutions, these banks. And even now I think some of the crypto market now is being seen, they're trying to regulate it basically. I know there was a new thing that's come out recently that I think in January of next year, the UK government will be looking to tax people on all their sort of crypto assets. And obviously that can be, the whole thing about the Bitcoin and things like that is based on the digital ledger and the transparency there. But you have to have a way in, you have to transfer your fiat currency into the digital realm, and that's how they're kind of getting a handle on it. They know they're kind of losing the power because obviously the fiat currency isn't backed by anything, other than a handshake, basically. It's not backed by gold anymore. So I think, like you say, it's got its bad reputation for criminals and things like that, but I mean, money since the dawn of time has had that as well. But there are other factors as well which come into play as well, which I'm sure you know fully about in terms of kind of like the energy usage and things like that. It doesn't use as much energy as the banking system at the moment, but then it's not as fully adopted as a banking system. And in some aspects, what we see as a fiat currency is almost kind of a digital ledger in its own right, in terms of if you look at how little money is actual cash reserves, and that whole kind of elasticity of money. And we were talking about books. One book I'd like to mention is The Creature of Jekyll Island, which goes into the whole mention of how the banking cartel came together to form the banking system as we know it under the guise of the Federal Reserve. So that's definitely a good thing to kind of look at. But all these kind of digital things, they align with the ideas of where the Elons want to go and where Jeff Bezos and all those kind of things kind of want to go. And that whole idea of that digital sovereignty,
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Because the state is not giving up, and this is I think what you're talking about there. So the crypto dream is kind of there, but then the state continues to kind of claw back, right? So exchanges that you mentioned of how you get your money into and out. So all these attempts to have kind of big regulated crypto exchanges, some of them pretty disastrous, some of them fairly more stable, some of them becoming increasingly regulated by government. Attempts to tie up with existing banking products like through Visa, for instance. So some of the big crypto exchanges, you can have a Visa card, but then they're using the Visa system to do something which the crypto's supposed to do in a way, I guess. But I guess the key point is the state, and then you've got people like China and Brazil and people like that who are just coming up with their own state digital currencies, right? So digital central bank digital currencies is the term, and essentially say, okay, we're going to take the technology advantages, but we're not going to let anyone else run this, and we want to tax people, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of goes to the center of the whole thing, because all this stuff comes from a discussion within capitalism about how much the state should be able to control and around taxation and what the mandate of the state is. And I want to maybe, if you don't mind, go to look a little bit at some of these ideas that are behind all this, because these ideas, a lot of them come from the 1960s and 70s, and they're ideas that end up being what you could call anarcho-capitalist, and they're almost like the kind of radical wing of the kind of monetarists and the neoliberals. And you've got these very kind of big established thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and the Austrian school, and you've got people like Milton Friedman, who was an absolute kind of god of the neoliberals in the 1980s. And they're essentially they think that the role of the state has got too big and they're restricting capitalism. And that the state in a way is kind of enslaving people, and you need to kind of set the heroic capitalist entrepreneur free and kind of let the forces the animal forces of capitalism kind of run freer, right? The animal spirits, and they're the ones that then all these modern things kind of take off from, and then that ends up with things like, I mentioned this guy last time, Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, guy with the shaggy hair, former goalkeeper. He's got dogs named after monetarist philosophers, and does tantric yoga among other things, and was at the U.S. conservative conference giving Elon Musk a chainsaw. I mean, for many years he was kind of fringe, and I know people who know him and who studied with him in the economics faculty in Buenos Aires, and he used to do these rallies in theatres, very middle class scene, and people would go with like their boyfriends, girlfriends to these things, and he'd show this kind of slideshow, and his whole thing was essentially the central bank has stolen your money, and you need to abolish the central bank. And it's quite interesting because even the really kind of right wing pro capitalist politicians in Argentina, he would just basically say they were all communists. So for him, everyone was a communist, everyone was a socialist. And you just needed to kind of abolish the central bank, kind of get rid of the state, let currencies kind of just go free. They all then also get into crypto in a big way, and crypto scams. So Milei has constantly been, even a couple of months ago, there was a big one. He constantly had these scandals of kind of promoting crypto scams and rug pulls, which is when you kind of pipe up a currency and then you put, set the people who are behind it kind of sell out, and then they leave everyone broke essentially. So it's an interesting one because there's a kind of very libertarian kind of urge behind it. There's an urge of kind of freeing up from the state, and something which I'm not completely unsympathetic to. But then it's also just about kind of rich people moving away and not having any responsibility over, for anything, which for a society would be pretty disastrous, right? Because you essentially hollow out the institutions of the government, healthcare and healthcare and education and the courts. You hollow out an infrastructure, public infrastructure. You hollow all that stuff out, and then you're left with these kind of essentially kind of disaster zones with poor people, and then the rich people are off somewhere else, in either in micronations or somewhere. Yeah, so that I think we should talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a consensus though. I think as technology drive things forward, especially with sort of the advents of AI and things like that, the gap between the rich and the poor is only going to widen, but more catastrophically than ever before, just because it has that ability to move at a speed that other large changes through humanity didn't have. Like industrialization moved fairly fast, the printing press moved fairly fast, but what we're seeing now is just something which is kind of moving it under its own kind of steam. And it's quite interesting when you talk about sort of these countries adopting these sort of cryptocurrencies as well as kind of a new form of sort of pushing things forward. And it's, as I mentioned before, with a lot of these banking institutions who hold large sums of these crypto, I mean, they're the big whales in it. They can almost regulate the market in their own way with the pump and dump schemes if they so want. Obviously, they're in it to make money as well. But it's like, if all these other countries are coming out with their own adoptions of their own cryptocurrencies, how can these other things sort of stabilize,
Yeah, but I wonder, and I know, you've dug into this a lot more than me. I mean, I wonder when you have central bank digital currencies and they essentially control all the clearing, the cryptocurrency can only kind of survive at the margins of that in a way, right?
I think the Federal Reserve did look at actually producing their own digital coin at some point. I don't know where that is right now. Something, you can probably put a little link in the bottom below if we do think of something on that.
But I wanted to ask you about stable coins as well. Where does that fit in between pure crypto and kind of regulated currencies?
Stable coins basically, they run like a handshake as well, pretty much. They run in, they're called stable coins because they run side by side parallels of whatever the fiat currency is. So they'll try and track what the US does. So the idea is you having something where nations can use a digital currency, which isn't going to necessarily be as volatile, but it's basically a fiat currency. Just in the digital world, it's not really, worth the sort of like paper it's kind of printed on. I mean, a lot of the cryptocurrency out there is like the old days of the penny stocks, which was just sort of trying to get rich on the back of things as well. But I think there is definitely there's something in it in terms of crypto and it moving forward. I think the one thing that worries me is because we don't know who's behind. Let me go back, actually. I think in terms of cryptocurrency, I think that's not what we need to be looking at. We need to actually be looking at what it actually lies upon, which is the blockchain and the transparency, which I think is something fundamentally which will actually change things going forward for some of these new states and things like that, because it's an amazing technology. But as you mentioned before, things like Bitcoin and stuff like that are relatively slow. I think people are just trying to get their hands in the market with these stable coins. I don't really see the point of it, because the other thing as well with the digital currency or cryptocurrency is that it doesn't support the hidden secret tax, which we know as inflation. It just doesn't have that. And Bitcoin is described as digital gold because in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, it's going to run out. Its value will increase, and essentially it will be a kind of better product for most of the people out there. But it does have those inklings as well where, who does it really benefit? And some people actually think it benefits people on the right.
Also, it's become a kind of store of value, right? If you've got money, you can. It's a store of value. It's not doing anything.
Yeah,
it's a store of value. And also, the stablecoin is interesting because it has been adopted widely in places like Turkey, where you've got chronic currency instability and forex risk.
Yeah.
But at the same time, with kind of strong element of anonymity and lack of state oversight as well, right?
But unless the governments can actually find a way of taxing it, I don't think it's going to be something that will be a core part of our everyday living. But also that's why it probably will work with places like China, where everything is inbuilt into the system and the government oversees everything, and as they rise, it could be something where they say, well, you need to adopt our currency now, because the dollar's failing,
Yeah. Well, that's another episode, I think, to talk about as well, of kind of where do things go in the world where the dollar becomes less influential. I think it's really, really important. I want to go back just before we move on, talk a little bit about El Salvador, because they were a country that wanted to become a Bitcoin state, and again, I think it is kind of culturally, kind of associated with this idea of kind of new governments and new states and digital states. So they wanted to become the Bitcoin state. From what I understand, the state bought a lot of cryptocurrency and then lost big time on the bets, and so actually lost a lot of taxpayers' money there. There was a lot of marketing, obviously. The president, is this guy kind of very social media, kind of friendly, kind of modern communicator called Bukele, who kind of comes kind of a bit of an outsider and then eventually becomes president. Very much also on a law and order ticket. And then, of course, El Salvador's business from going to be the Bitcoin Republic actually becomes the mega prisons. And now the business model for El Salvador seems to be allowing other people to send people to their mega prisons. It's a pretty horrible business model. You've got this small state, you lock up kind of half of the population, and then you start saying, hey, we're really good at building prisons. You can send us your people. And obviously was involved in that very notorious case recently in the US with Garcia Borrego, I think he's called, who ended up being mistakenly deported and ended up in this mega prison. They've sent him back now, finally. But Bukele had that very famous White House appearance where he kind of showed up and said, yeah, just send me your criminals, I'll take them. He just paid me a fee. I thought there was some real irony in kind of how that all ended up, from the sort of failed Bitcoin experiment to...
Well, it seems going back to the actual name of the podcast, it seems like he didn't really have much of a plan to begin with. But it's if you look at the trajectory of sort of things like Bitcoin since its inception, sort of 2008, 2009, when it really started to skyrocket, year on year, it's done progressively a lot better than any of the other stocks out there, S&P 500, any of that kind of stuff. But because of its volatility, when it drops, it drops. So obviously, if he's bought in at a ridiculous high point, and then there's been a rug pull on it for whatever reason, or whoever's conducting that rug pull, that's the other thing as well. It still gives the ability for countries or economies to be crippled quite quickly overnight. And I think that's the idea of not being regulated and being decentralized has its ups, but without the regulatory things in place, if you lose your money, you lose your money, and that's it. And if you're backing, the currency of your country on it, it's quite a devastating place to be.
Yeah, yeah. Backtrack a little bit and go to some of the kind of wilder shores of this whole argument about escaping the state. Two I wanted to talk about in particular. One is seasteading, and the other is the bunker economy.
Okay.
And I think they're both kind of interesting ideas and involve similar people. But I wanted to start a little bit with a book that I know you'd be reading. There's a book called The Sovereign Individual. It was published quite a long time ago. And then it was reissued and with a new foreword by Peter Thiel, who we've talked about a lot. Prince of Darkness, VC capitalist, a lot of tech,
PayPal,
PayPal, that Peter Thiel. So he reads that book, really likes it, does a new edition of it. It's a bit of a Bible for him.
Because the book's about, 20 years old, or something like that, in that kind of region?
Yeah, and again, the idea of the book is that governments hold back the sovereign individual, and the sovereign individual is this kind of super intelligent, savvy, wealthy individual who essentially is the investor because he or she is good at doing investment, and is the capitalist that's making everything move, and the state is holding that individual back. And it's about creating strategies for that sovereign individual to be able to flourish in today's world, either by escaping the constraints of the state or setting up new states.
So a lot of it's kind of like the transition now into this kind of information age now, this digital age, and how we can sort of kind of survive within that as individuals is kind of what I'm sort of kind of picking up on, at least.
No, a lot of it is literally about how do you avoid the state if you're a very rich individual.
Right. Okay.
How do you get away from the state and have as little as possible, as little control over you as possible, and pay as little tax as possible? Now that idea kind of goes into many, many different directions. One of those directions is people who get into this thing called seasteading. It's a very California thing. Peter Thiel, again, someone contacts him and gets him involved, and he likes the idea. And they put money into this thing called the Seasteading Institute. We'll put some links in the podcast for you to go and see some more stuff to read about this. And then there's a whole bunch of experiments where people literally go and try and start new countries.
Oh wow.
Either on boats or by building platforms and structures in the sea. And there's lots of ideas like having flotillas, having big platforms, having kind of big kind of pods in the ocean. And some of those actually they have tried to do, and they've nearly all been disastrous.
I mean, with those kind of things, what type of kind of population are you looking at housing in some of these kind of seasteading things?
Yeah, permanent housing, run as a corporation, and essentially acting as a sovereign state, usually in international waters, so outside of territorial waters. And they've nearly always ended up in quite comical. I mean, I think it'd be actually something quite funny to make a sort of comical movie around, a comedy movie around, because most of them have ended in sort of farce. And it's two reasons why none of them have worked. The first one mainly is that nearby states kind of don't like it. So there was one in Thailand, and they were kind of outside of Thailand, and then the Thai Navy kept on showing up and kind of, are you with us or are you somewhere else? They didn't like it, and eventually they shut it down. There's another one there was a couple in the South Pacific that they tried to get arrangements with nearby states so that they could set up in international waters. Again, didn't work out politically. And then the other reason is literally getting sunk. So there's like loads of the weather and just not having good enough crafts or solid enough, just basically getting swamped essentially, or sinking. So it's those kind of things. Again, we can put some references into the text. There's been loads of these attempts, but it's for me it's really interesting that they got into it, because it's a really radical idea. It's kind of Waterworld. I like to think of all these things as they've watched these Silicon Valley people, they've watched some science fiction film and then they've tried to sort of make their version of it.
Yeah, I think that's quite common. I think the dark side was obviously if they're creating these sort of seasteads is that there comes the darker side of military communication, protect themselves from sort of the larger states, from pirates, from, all those kind of things around. And, it becomes in its own right, it may become a kind of police state in its own way, who comes in, who goes out again. Essentially becomes pretty much the model they're trying to escape from. The only difference is that they will be governing as opposed to, the bureaucrats that we have in power today.
Yeah, well, their model is a corporation running things. So you run it as a corporation with a sort of CEO in charge. You remember last week we talked a little bit about, or in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about this idea that Curtis Yarvin had of neo-cameralism. And it's basically like these kind of mini states that are run as corporations. It's quite an interesting quote from that guy we mentioned, Nick Land, another of these kind of dark Enlightenment theorists, and he is into these ideas as well of kind of tiny states. And he says the only real fundamental right is the right to leave. So you can vote with your feet. And then the idea is you'd have all these tiny little states, and it's just a competition to who's got the citizens. If you just go somewhere else. But within that polity, within that sovereignty, you don't necessarily have any rights. So it's more like a contract.
Right.
Kind of like if I work for someone and I've got a contract that governs what I can take out of the office, and it's more like that. It's not about citizens.
Yeah, so it's their vision of utopia, really, what they foresee as a utopia.
Yeah, it is, and I think there's a strong sense of utopia about it. I mean, they're into science fiction. The radical thinkers, going, let's go and start a new state in the middle of the ocean, kind of thing. It is really radical, but it's all filtered through these kind of very capitalist filter, and a lot of just selfish ideas as well, right? That you just want to escape, and you just don't want to pay taxes, and you don't want to be with people who don't have any money, and you want to get away from all that. So for me, there is a positive side of this kind of, okay, let's go and do something amazing and new. But there's also a negative side of kind of, well, let's just get away from all these other people who, are having difficulties, or, might not be the kind of people we want to see. And then also that, it's kind of dystopian in the sense that it's, you're going to be in this place that's going to be really anti-democratic and just run as a kind of company. So it's kind of a dystopia as well.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because, as nations, we sign a kind of invisible contract that makes us part of society. And like with something like that, and with their manifestos of producing something like that, you'd have to have something almost where the CEO is kind of, you get a new CEO every sort of 3-4 years or so before it comes to dictatorship. But I mean, one thing I was kind of, is this kind of like a halfway house for these tech barons as well? Because when we look at them trying to sort of colonize space and Mars, like we talked about before, are they sort of kind of half given up on that idea and saying, right, we'll just do this just in case, because maybe we don't have the legs to do what we're really trying to do upstairs, and it's just a lot of hot air,
Yeah, I think they probably kind of oscillate between the two, right? And the seasteading thing, unless I'm wrong, has been pretty disastrous, and it seems to have lost a lot of momentum. And it seems like a hard slog to me. There's other kind of ways of doing this. Right at the beginning of this whole thing, and Quinn Slobodian talks about this a lot in his kind of book Crack Up Capitalism. A little bit technical, but it's worth going into. One of the first things they really liked was Hong Kong. Okay. And then they also liked Singapore. They liked Dubai. They like these places that are kind of like almost like city-states that run really well.
Strong financial foundations.
And don't have some other big government, and they just kind of can set new types of rules. So when I'm talking about Hong Kong before China took it over again, when it was kind of a kind of independent territory under British sovereignty, but kind of run independently. So that's one thing, is these kind of successful city-states. So that was kind of right at the beginning, and that's what a lot of these monetarists and people like Milton Friedman kind of see, and they think, oh, this is an interesting model for society. And again, quite interesting, they're not really democracies, most of these places. And then the other one is things like special economic zones, special export zones. So these, sometimes states, they create these kind of special areas where there's no taxation, or they're run by slightly different rules in terms of everything from accounting to, land allocation. So they had this idea of what if you could kind of almost get these kind of special export zones turn them into kind of sovereign places, like free ports. You know, where you can kind of have your expensive paintings or gold in a free port, and it's not really taxed by anyone. It's just kind of
Just
in this
in
kind
holding,
of sovereignty limbo, you know, kind of
like a purgatory of
kind of purgatory of your assets, right? But you're not really sure who's going to tax them, right?
Yeah.
So that was another model for them, and then they've actually tried to do experiments based around those kind of ideas. So notably one in Honduras, they tried to form like a sovereign city in Honduras, place called I think it's a place called Puerto Cortes, and they essentially tried to set it up as a kind of separate legal entity with its own kind of governance board, wouldn't be regulated by the laws of Honduras. And then of course, you know, it actually happened to a certain degree, but then they started getting into all kinds of conflicts with the Honduran state, you know, and also with the people around the area who were kind of like, you know, we don't want our sovereignty from the existing entity taken away, and how come these foreigners can come down here and just start doing their own thing in part of the sovereign territory, right? Because that's the other thing, right? The seasteading thing is about essentially moving away into international waters. Makes sense, right? If you try and do it by kind of carving out little bits of an existing state, yeah, you're going to have conflict there as well, right? And I mean, obviously now Elon Musk, as I mentioned earlier with Texas, you know, there's going to be tension there between them and the government, you know, and the existing government as well. So I think those are two important notes. And then just finally, I think it's worth mentioning the bunkers. So around the same time they got into seasteading was also around the same time they made, you know, they became just so incredibly rich, which is a time of, after the financial crisis, quantitative easing and the asset bubble, and they just became, you know, like just unimaginably rich, these people. And so what did? They all started going off and building bunkers and trying to get new citizenships as well. So, you know, all those kind of passports you can buy online from different island stuff, they've got all of those. They've bought all the passports you can get from all the different places, sovereign individual. And then they also thought, oh, let's go to New Zealand and build like big nuclear bunkers, and in places in the US. And again, I mean, it's pretty, you know, for me, it's pretty disgusting in a way. It's just the idea of these people not wanting to solve the problems of society, but then just wanting to kind of have a safe space to go to that they can go to with security guards and electric fences and in some remote place that won't be nuked or is less likely to be nuked, right?
It sounds like science fiction, you know, and there will be the sort of gatekeepers deciding which entertainers they get in, which scientists they have, you know. So it begs the question, do they know something we don't, or have they just got too much money to spend?
Well, I mean, I guess if you've got unlimited wealth, why not have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, right? So there's that element. They can do it just because they can. And then I think there's also the element that I think somewhere deep down, a lot of them are really conscious of the fact they are destroying the planet.
Well, I think it sounds like they're hedging their bets. If you look at, you know, we talk about seasteading and you talk about the bunkers, they're sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. One's their utopia, the other one's their dystopia. You know, so, you know, with that kind of money, brings great power in that kind of way as well. You know, I did notice something a couple of years back that they were spending quite extortionate amounts of money on these things. They all seem to be doing it at the same time. So I don't know if it was like egos brushing against each other that was kind of doing it. But I know when it came to the public eye, people did start getting worried. You know, probably the preppers were probably cheering, thinking, yeah, you know, we're right. These guys are doing it too. But yeah, the seasteading kind of makes more sense than the kind of micronations. But it reminds me of it's quite comical actually, and it kind of brings in digital currency as well. But I don't know if you remember the rapper or the artist Akon.
Yeah.
And he wanted to build his Wakanda and his digital coin and his currency and all that kind of stuff. You know, had all these kind of wonderful sort of, you know, brochures of what this place was kind of look like. But you know, when these seasteads are sort of kind of built up as a corporation, obviously they have to bring in their own regulations as well to make sure that it's. I know you say people can just, you know, vote by their feet and just kind of leave, but they're still setting a premise of rules as any government would, as well. You know.
Yeah, but their rules are almost like it's like more like a legal contract around between property owners and, you know, workers and people who are living in those places. So they actually want almost like a kind of minimal state. There is a contract, and then people just get on with it. And then if you think there's someone more attractive, we can make more money. The kind of sea-stating it down the road or down the, further down the ocean, you can go and move there if you want. And that's kind of their vision. I mean, one of the things about all this is that, you mentioned about Acon. A lot of this stuff is quite, I mean, for me, it's not bad, again, and some people maybe wouldn't want me to say that, but utopia is a really powerful idea. And people going off and forming their own version of something, their own country, their own state, I mean, sure, that's quite exciting. And when I look around and see a lot of the states, how they act right now, it's pretty tired. It looks tired, right? They're not providing great services. The democracy in some ways tired, seems a bit flawed. And they tap into that, right? Because there's a genuine sense that actually you're not getting that much out of the state anymore. And it's a bit oppressive and there's a lot of surveillance. And so, some of it is about, let's go and do something completely different, right? And that's where sci-fi and all that stuff comes in. Sci-fi is a great place to kind of iterate ideas. And, Wakanda, I mean, Wakanda's cool, right? It's great. It's, and in a way, I think this idea of going off and doing something new, that was really important. That was really important in the 19th century. People going off and trying to form their own communities. And
I definitely think it's something that's even more important now. I mean, the way I kind of look at things is that just in terms, again, of how AI and technology is moving so exponentially fast over the coming years, it seems that a lot of the governments and humanity as a whole is still living in this age of industrialization and labour work, and the mindset hasn't changed. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of people left behind. They're just not going to be on the same boat because they're in this old traditional model. The school systems aren't keeping up to where things may potentially be. As you're aware, I sort of home educate my kids as well, and in some of the groups that we're in, we've seen a number of teachers who have now joined the group and pulled their kids out because they just feel the system is so old, it's archaic. And that's when it comes back to kind of, what these technocrats want, because there's so much bureaucracy and red tape surrounding these things. It takes so long for the system to change. It's like a big tanker as opposed to a little lifeboat that's got the agility to steer. So I kind of see where they're going from the kind of seasteads, but at the same time, I do find it quite comical. You talk about how these things leaking and, just falling apart, basically. But I mean, is this something that can be researched by people who are kind of looking at the podcast now? Is there like places that you can go to see, okay, there's 15 seasteads being pushed off the corner of here, or, is there a lot of backhanded money going off to other governments as well? So although we're in international waters, we still want to kind of keep you at bay.
Yeah, I mean, we'll put some resources up. But I guess my sort of big question is, could we do a good version of this? I mean, I don't like their version of it because it's fundamentally, these kind of, Silicon Valley kind of thinking that's very kind of technocratic, capitalist. It's based on the idea of accepting kind of differences between people as being somehow natural, that rich people are better than poor people. I mean, could we go and do something that's actually good? I mean, in the 60s, you had communes, and it was about people going off and trying to form new ways of living that were actually more democratic and kind of more humane and kind of educating their kids in a different way and those kind of stuff, right? A lot of those obviously were failures. There was, all kinds of reasons culturally why they failed. But the idea of going off and creating something new and people doing that, rather than these kind of tech billionaires, for me, maybe there's something there. Maybe we should be looking more at those kind of things.
I mean, I think we should be looking at stuff like that, especially if you get the right people in the room. The problem is the types of money that these tech guys have got. It really kind of taints the idea of kind of where it should be going, and we've seen that in the past where they may not be willing to like listen to what people are saying or to snowball things. I do worry about, if the tech billionaires are involved in those types of things, that it will just kind of get washed away with money.
For sure. And it's also, what you end up with, in a way, depends on what you start with in terms of your intentions and your ethics, right? And these people are profoundly anti-ethical, and their vision of society is also very dark, and it's essentially based around the failure of the rest of society. It is about escaping. It's not about making things better for other people or for society as a whole. It's about getting away because you are convinced that society is failing and it's going to fail, and that comes across so strongly, especially in the US at the moment, and how there's a very strong dose of how US society is set up. of kind of flight to the suburbs, gated communities, the idea of just kind of getting away from these horrible people in the cities, right? And I think that, you know, that if it starts with that intention, it ends badly. And I think of the science fiction movie Elysium with Matt Damon, where they're in that kind of satellite that's orbiting around, that's all beautiful kind of gardens and stuff, but only certain people can get in. And then you've got these kind of rundown, kind of almost like kind of Mexican shanty towns kind of on Earth with environmental degradation. And that's where they're heading to, because they essentially don't believe that human beings can do anything good collectively. Essentially, they think only a few people can go off and do something to survive.
Let's go back to that quote. Let's go back to that quote there. I can't remember what the quote is now, but you mentioned in one of the previous episodes about sort of, you know, we've been around for 5,000 years, you know.
Mark Andreessen's interview after the Techno Optimist. The thing is, there's nothing optimistic about this for them. You know, they have a very dark idea of where Earth is going, and that's why they think we need to move away from it. And that's a real problem, because, you know, there's 7-8 billion people on the planet, and, you know, we need to take people with us. And I like the idea of going off and doing new things and not waiting for anybody else.
Let's do
it. But very much, if you can do something new, and I'm convinced of this, and you can make it work, then maybe everyone else will look at you and go, okay, maybe we can do that as well. But I think you need to do it with a spirit of openness, experimentation, and with an end which is, you know, for good and not for evil, right? And I think that's a bit the issue here is, you know, what's your end game here, and what are you really trying to do?
I suppose a lot of your main oppositions from that then will still come from sort of surrounding governments and countries who will try to sort of paint you as a cult or paint you as something negative, because they want your taxpayers' money. They don't want you to sort of suddenly go off to kind of some sort of seastead, where in actual fact what you want is, as you said, a working model that people look at and say, actually, maybe we can replicate that in our own system in some way, or take the good parts of that. Because it's not going to be perfect, but, you know, getting the right people around the table is key. And, you know, how many people around the table do you need, and who are those people, you know, to be, is I suppose one of the kind of key questions, you know.
No, I think it's really important, and I think it does need to be built on a kind of ethical pact and an ethical agreement amongst people. And that's the really hard thing, and around culture, right? And I think it's culture that's key to all this. You know, if the culture's right, and you're looking to, you know, expand possibilities, expand, you know, interaction between people in a good way, raise the level of culture and education, then you can do a lot. But it's having that culture that allows people to then make agreements with each other, do all kinds of new things. If you don't have that, if your model of humanity is basically that they're out to get us, and we need to kind of just build a big fence around us and keep undesirables out, I think it's very difficult to have that culture.
I think that's a problem of sort of new media, or, you know, social media and stuff like that, is the power of manipulation that, again, these tech guys are in control of, you know. And as humans, we know how easily manipulated we are as well. History's shown that over time, you know. And how do you sort of barricade yourself from that? And are we quick enough to do that, you know?
I think it's a really important point. And generally, you only get utopian experiments when society breaks down. This is part of the problem. So, you know, it's when there's a real crisis that people will take the leap to do something new. But that also that also involves big risks as well.
And maybe we're seeing that right now.
I think we might be.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Ben. I think we'll round it up there, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Simon.